Hello everyone, and welcome back to the history of the First Crusades, where last time we saw the origins of the First Crusade and left off with Pope Urban preaching for the First Crusade, asking for Christian soldiers to march east to recover Jerusalem. Now, this was not a single large army that left, instead many small armies left scattered at different times, and today we're going to be looking at the first of those to leave in what is often referred to misleadingly as the Peasants' Crusade. Now I say misleadingly because there were certainly lords involved in this, and there were several different armies that we'll look into, but all of those lords were minor lords, mostly counts, rather than the dukes and princes who would be accompanying the later princes' crusades. Now, the instigating factor in these initial crusades was a man by the name of Peter the Hermit. He was an aging evangelist from the Picardy region of France, and despite really quite humble background, he managed to raise approximately 30,000 troops and non-combatants. And to kind of put that into perspective, 30 years earlier in 1066, when William the Conqueror raised an army to invade England, he raised about 14,000 men, and that was considered novel and large at the time. So a random evangelist managing to raise over twice that number is really quite stunning. And this is really coming down to the charismatic nature of Peter's preaching. He started preaching before Clermont had actually been held, started preaching when he first heard about the first mentions of the crusade by Pope Urban, even before it was official, and he was really good at giving these kind of apocalyptic populist sermons that really painted him as a visionary and urged many people to abandon their lives and march east. It is possible that he may have been appointed directly by the Pope during the Pope's tour in 1095, or he may have just simply heard about it and took it upon himself to lead this preaching. It also is very likely that he started preaching a lot of stories about atrocities being committed in the East. And certainly there were attacks on Christians sporadically throughout the Muslim occupation. There was no great purging of Christians, but there were constant sporadic attacks, and so he likely played these up in a lot of his preaching to help fire up the locals. And he was successful. Not only did he manage to attract, as I said, lots of non-combatants, but along with those trained troops and levies, he did recruit a series of minor lords, and none of them were major, mostly at the count level, and a lot of these we'll see later. One that he kept with him for the first part of the campaign was Walter, Lord of Bossy Saint-Sauveur, who we will see playing a major role later. He also seems to have appointed a series of delegates. One was a local priest called Gottschalk, who led a very large army. He raised 15,000 men in southern Germany. We'll come back to his fate later. It's also possible that he appointed Volkmar as another delegate who gathered an army in Saxony and Bohemia, and also very possible that he had a major influence over Count Emich, whose rather bloody campaign we'll see in a little bit. Now, Peter's own army was mostly French. As we said, Peter himself was French. He mostly raised minor lords in the Chartres and Champagne regions of France. This is the army that he took with him, and he continued his recruitment as he began to march through the Rhineland. So Peter's army would follow the pilgrim route, going through the Rhineland, down the Danube to Hungary, and then crossing the Balkans to Constantinople. And his large army, which was also kind of sort of just a very large mob, started gathering in Cologne in the 12th of April 1096 and immediately started causing trouble. See, the problem with raising a very large army of people who really don't know much about warfare, and telling them that the Pope is ordering them to kill the non-believers is a bit dangerous to the local non-believers. Very notably, Europe had many Jewish communities within it at the time. Now, Peter never organised direct attacks against the Jewish community. However, that is not to say that he didn't bully the local communities. Certainly in Trier, he did bully the local Jews into supplying provisions, intimidating them, notably using letters from French Jews who had already been threatened and attacked by other groups in France. And it's also worth noting that Peter definitely is not in the clear for the attacks that did happen, which we will unfortunately look at very shortly. He did preach anti-Jewish hate in order to rile up and recruit for his armies. Forces that followed his armies did certainly do very, very violent attacks, and very notably, Peter may well have encouraged Count Emich, who we will see later. Now, on the 12th of April, Peter's army left Cologne, and at this point he had 20,000 troops and non-combatants with him. It was a line of march a mile long, and he covered ground fairly well for such an otherwise disorganised group. Averaged about 17 miles a day, could get up to 25 miles on good roads. Notably, Peter himself symbolically was riding a donkey during this entire procession, and it is also worth noting that not everyone was using the road since they were following the Danube. Some did travel down the Danube on boats. 23rd of April, Peter and his followers arrived at Regensburg, and this again is where they start to get their hands bloody. They conducted forced baptisms of the Jewish communities at Regensburg, not killing them, but forcibly baptizing them. So again, really mustn't get the idea that Peter's a good guy in all of this. He was just less horrid than what was to come. Now, Peter was actually quite organised in his march. He knew what he was doing, unlike some of the people who were following him, and notably his lieutenant, Walter Saint-Sauveur, was sent ahead of the main force and reached the Hungarian border in mid-May. There he negotiated the safe passage for the army, since it would be very alarming to the Hungarian king to have 20,000 people just turning up. And indeed, Walter managed to organise access to markets, which was very important because Peter's army did not wait for the Pope's recommendation of setting out on the 15th of August, which would have been after the harvest. Instead, he's turning up in the early summer, which is the leanest months of the medieval world, where the harvests are not yet in, all the winter supplies have run dry, and there's very slim pickings to go around. And so having access to food is really quite important if you're travelling around with 20,000 random people. However, it is worth noting that they did not get access to buying arms, the local Hungarians not particularly wanting to arm the 20,000 random strangers who are turning up. Things started to get a bit trickier when they reached the Byzantine border, where Walter's men were denied access to Belgrade's markets. This led to a violent episode in which 60 pilgrims were killed. At this point, the Byzantines and Alexius started to realise exactly what Alexius's earlier pleas for assistance had actually brought upon them, and Walter was very quickly rushed/escorted across the Byzantine Empire. He was treated as an ally, but he was also made sure to be watched the whole time. And really here, Emperor Alexius feared kind of two things. One was the food shortages. He was worried the large forces that were going to be arriving were just going to rob the nearby lands and leave his own people to starve. Alexius also really wasn't in the most stable position. He had only just recently come to power by a violent coup, and he had many, many enemies, especially those who had lost power during his coup, who might see the random 20,000 foreigners as very useful mercenaries. And so Alexius really wanted all of these approaching crusaders to spend as little time in the Byzantine Empire as possible. So Walter himself reached Constantinople on the 20th of July 1096, and there he would wait for the rest of Peter's army. Now, Peter's army did not have anywhere near as smooth a passage as Walter. Notably, on the Hungarian border at the town of Semlin, there was a dispute over supplies. There's also rumours of mistreatment of Walter's men, and an inciting incident has been quoted as being an argument over the purchase of shoes. However, these fairly minor disputes quickly grew, and a knight called Godfrey Burrell, who unfortunately we will see a lot of, led an assault and sacked the entire town. The Byzantines heard of the sacking of Semlin and immediately evacuated the city of Belgrade and left it to be plundered by Peter's army. As Peter's army reached Nish, the Greek governor of Nicetas negotiated a market in return for hostages, notably including Godfrey Burrell. So he would give food to Peter's army as long as the ringleader of the last set of fighting was in his dungeon waiting for the army to pass safely through, then Godfrey would be returned. However, even this went wrong. The market very quickly broke down into arguments once more. Peter tried and failed to calm down the situation, and this led the Greeks to deploy their army and scatter Peter's army. And Peter's army fled into the nearby countryside. On the 7th of June, most of them still regathered at a town called Bela Palanka, where they took in the local harvest and left for Sofia. However, at this point, only 2/3 of Peter's army returned to him, the rest scattered, never returning, most simply going home at that point. When Peter's army arrived at Sofia, they were met and escorted by Alexis's own army, and there they were kept under strict watch, not allowed to stop in any one place for more than 3 days, rapidly being moved along the coast, arriving at Adrianople on the 22nd of July, and finally arriving at the gates of Constantinople on the 1st of August. This was still quite an impressive feat. Peter arrived with 2/3 of his army. They had covered 1,000 miles in 5 months, which is pretty good going for a disorganized band in the 11th century. But if you thought that the journey to Constantinople was bad, well, we've not even started on what goes wrong. So when Peter's forces arrived at Constantinople, Alexius was probably less than pleased. When he had called to the west for help, he had expected what Byzantine emperors had been granted in the past, that is, a scattering of random mercenaries, the odd lord maybe. What he had not expected was armies to be sent his way, and definitely what he had not expected was over 10,000 random people of dubious martial quality just turning up, having plundered a lot of their way across the Balkans to get there. And first thing was first, in order to secure his own capital, Peter's army was very quickly moved across the Sea of Marmara into what is now mainland Turkey, at the time referred to as Asia Minor. There, Peter's army was stationed at the force of Kibotos, where he met up with his lieutenant Walter. Now, Kibotos was a fort that was used by Western mercenaries. It was well supplied, they had been reinforced with Italian levies, and it was in a pretty good position, being only 25 miles from the Seljuk capital at Nicaea. But Alexis really did not have a lot of faith in this army, and urged Peter to wait until the main Crusade forces would arrive. Now, having just marched for 1,000 miles, having got into several frays along the way, and now being 25 miles from the enemy capital, waiting wasn't exactly very high on Peter's army's to-do list. Now, the one person who could possibly hold them together was the very charismatic Peter himself. Unfortunately, Peter got tied up in the imperial capital acting as a diplomat, because he needed to keep the supplies flowing for his really quite large army, And again, arriving when he did, supplies were not massively abundant. Now, he did this quite well. Peter managed to keep the supplies flowing into Kibitos, but this left his army really quite disorganized. He was the only unifying feature. With him gone, command fell onto individual captains who really just sought plunder for their own small groups of men. And so they set out plundering the nearby countryside. Now, the nearby countryside was officially mostly conquered by the Muslim Seljuk Turks, but that was only a recent development. Plenty of the locals were Greek Christians, but the Crusaders really didn't take the time or really care enough to separate one from the others, and rather indiscriminately started looting. Not only that, but the individual commanders would all try and one-up one another. Notably, in September, French raiders breached the walls of Nicaea itself and went on a minor raid there. Germans and Italians, under the command of the Italian Lord Rinaldo, weren't going to be outdone by the French, and so they seized a nearby castle at Zerigordo. Now, capturing the castle was easy, keeping it was hard. The downside being 25 miles away from the enemy's capital is you're 25 miles away from the enemy's main army, and they were trapped and massacred by troops sent from Nicaea. Very few people survived this, interestingly, including the leader of the group, Ronaldo, and all of those who survived did so by converting to Islam and becoming slaves. Now, this was a major affront to the waiting army, who wouldn't let this defeat of part of their army by their Seljuk enemy go unanswered. And so, once again, Godfrey Borel, the same guy who led previous sackings, decided to rally the majority of the army and march on Nicaea itself. This was a horrendous mistake, and on the 21st of October, Sultan Kilij Aslan of the Seljuks led his army personally. And here the disorganization of Peter's army really became apparent. The Seljuk forces were absolutely accomplished horse archers, and they led a rapid series of engagements in which they slowly broke apart the crusading army until they had managed to isolate a large number of the Crusaders' knights away from their supporting infantry and then slaughtered them. Walter Saint-Sauveur and Rainulf de Bourges were both killed, Walter being killed by a hail of arrows. And it's been said on many other channels by many other historians, medieval knights really were the tanks of their day. They could have a major effect on combat, but isolated as they were vulnerable. But even more so, without their knights forming a solid basis, the remaining foot soldiers were absolutely outclassed, and they were very rapidly overrun. The Seljuks pushed their advantage and seized the base at Kibitos, and almost the entirety of Peter's army was annihilated. Only a very small handful survived, mostly knights being heavily armoured and fast enough to get away. They all hid in a nearby abandoned fort until they were rescued by the Greek relief force. After that, Peter and the tiny remnants of his army really had no choice but to wait around for the other Crusaders to turn up. Peter would still continue on the crusade, but he wouldn't continue to be any kind of major part, having lost his army and really therefore all of his influence. Okay, so Peter's march was an absolute disaster. Sacked Christian towns, had fights with the Byzantines, and promptly got themselves massacred as soon as they reached enemy territory. But I did mention many others that were following in his wake, his various deputies, lieutenants, other people he had influenced, so surely things went a bit better for them. Well, absolutely not. Now we turn to the really dark part about this, and we look at what happened with Count Emich and his army. So whereas Peter tried to at least hold his men back from outright violence against Jewish community, Emich took the exact opposite approach. and really focused on the Jewish communities above actually getting anywhere near the Crusades' objectives. Things started on the 3rd of May, where Emmek's troops attacked the Jewish walled enclave in the city of Speyer. They killed a dozen who refused forced conversion. One woman killed herself rather than converting. The rest of the Jewish population were managed to be saved by Bishop Rudiger. And one thing that is very notable with this, and will happen again and again, is that the attacking army was helped by the local townspeople, who were all too happy to rob their Jewish neighbours. Now in Speyer, things went a little bit better. The bishop was very against the attacks. All the townspeople who had taken part in the attacks had their hands cut off. Notably, this is the punishment for theft, and that is really because a lot of this violence really seems to be driven by simple greed. They didn't particularly hate their Jewish neighbours, they just wanted their Jewish neighbours' wealth, or at least their perceived wealth. But this was only the start. On the 18th of May, Emmek arrived at Worms, and once again, with local help, he attacked the Jewish quarter, but this time there was a massacre. The Torah scrolls were desecrated. Some of the Jewish population managed to flee to the bishop's palace, but the bishop's palace was itself besieged, and on the 20th of May, all of those inside were killed. In this attack, hundreds died. And then things just kept getting worse. As his army became more and more used to the violence, each city they reached hosted worse atrocities than the last, culminating in Mainz, where there was a major Jewish community being led by the chief rabbi Kalonymus, who was known to the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the Archbishop of Mainz did initially order the gates shut against Emmek's army, and the local Jewish population did try to bribe both the Archbishop to keep the gates closed and Emmek to leave with £7 of gold, but this didn't work. On the 26th of May, the Archbishop fled and the gates were opened, and this started days of killing and looting across the city. A group of Jewish survivors did hold out at the Archbishop's empty palace, and they put up a fierce resistance, but were killed down to the last man. Many instances of suicide were recorded across the Jewish population in order to avoid violent forced conversion. Now, the chief rabbi Kalonymus managed to get 50 others to the Archbishop's country estate, where he hoped to find shelter, only to be betrayed once again. The Archbishop would offer him sanctuary only if they all converted to Christianity. Kalonymus refused, and with Count Emmek's forces closing in, he tried to assault the Archbishop's country estate, and he and all 50 of his followers were killed by the Archbishop's guards. All in all, approximately 1,000 died in the violence at Mainz. After Mainz, things did ease up, but this is largely because news of Emmek's violent march were really spreading. And so in Cologne, much of the Jewish population had already dispersed or were hiding among friendly locals by the time Emmek's forces arrived. Finding the Jewish quarter empty, Emmek instead made do with burning down the synagogue, desecrating the Torah. A few who were found were killed, but most of the focus was on looting. Now, some of Emmek's troops were not satisfied with merely looting, and some did hunt down the Jewish survivors who had fled into nearby areas. Now, slowly during this, Emmek had been making his way along following Peter's army, and in mid-July, Emmek's forces reached Hungary at the city of Weisselberg. But unlike Peter's army, Emmek's forces were refused crossing at the important bridge at the city, largely because the Hungarians knew exactly what Emmek's forces had been doing and did not want the violence to spread to Hungary itself. Now, Emmek's forces would not be put off by this. French and Swabian allies of Emmek began to construct siege engines to assault the city and pontoon bridges to cross the river. But as they did so, there were rumours of King Koloman of Hungary's army approaching, and this really destroyed morale. Up to this point, Emek's forces had been attacking mostly unarmed men. The idea of a king's army approaching really scattered a lot of them, and desertion really started to take off. Those troops that remained around Weisselberg were routed by a sally from within the city itself, and what's left of the army scattered and went their own way. Some of the French nobles left to find other routes and other leaders to hang on to. Many simply turned around and returned home, including Emek himself, who clearly decided that slaughtering people across Europe was exactly what the Pope had in mind. Now, Emek's forces were by far the bloodiest of the peasants' crusading armies. However, none of the rest made it as far as Byzantium. Gottschalk's army of 15,000 Germans did negotiate a truce with the Hungarian king upon reaching the border, and surrendered their arms to the Hungarian king as part of that. However, as they went through Hungary, they began indiscriminate foraging, which the Hungarians eventually responded to by massacring the now unarmed army. Volkmar was possibly another of Peter's delegates. He had gathered a large army of Saxons and Bohemians. They again were scattered by the Hungarians in late June. Now, other groups did continue sporadic attacks on the Jewish communities in and around Cologne throughout June and July. And again, these were very much helped by locals, but none reached the same levels as the devastation at Mans. This did start to settle down in the late summer, possibly as the harvest came in and demands on resources lessened, or possibly simply because the local Jewish communities had nothing left worth stealing, so were no longer such inviting targets. So there we have the first chapter of the Crusades. Armies numbering a total of over 30,000 men marching east, and what they had achieved was massacring populations in European cities, fighting various other Christian armies, and getting themselves very rapidly massacred along the way. But for Emperor Alexis of the Byzantine Empire, his headache was only just starting. So far, the Crusades had done nothing but cost him a huge amount of resources, sporadic looting and death, as well as actually losing him territory. But things would get worse for the Byzantine Emperor, as next week we're going to look at the Prince's Crusade, and we'll see what happens when organised crusaders start turning up and cause even more havoc than the mob that preceded them. So thank you for bearing with me through this rather dark episode. Unfortunately, it's not going to be the darkest that this series gets, but there is certainly plenty more absolute incompetence to come. Hope you found this interesting, useful or informative, and otherwise I hope to catch you in the next video. Until then, take care. Cheers.